Welcome, learners, to Psychology 275, Culture and Psychology. We will start our journey into the culture of human psychology with, of course, us humans. So our first module is on culture and human nature, where we will start to define each of these terms. But first, hello. I'm Dr. Griffin, and this is Naz the homie. She is my pit bull German short-haired pointer rescue dog. And really, she's the one who rescued me, of course. And you might see her one of these days walking around in the background, so I thought I'd introduce her. I'd like to start off with not what I'm going to teach you, but why I'm going to teach you. I'm here because my mission is to nurture self-awareness, compassion, and liberation in each of you. I believe that we have the power to shape the world around us. I'm here to teach us that we do not have to accept the world we were born into, and in fact, it's our responsibility to contribute to its change. First, though, we need to understand our own culture. That's where self-awareness comes in. And we need to have compassion for ourselves in difficult moments, not to make ourselves feel better, but because life is hard. And that's okay. And finally, I'm here to teach liberation because we can free ourselves from self-sabotaging, stereotypical thinking, and discrimination in our behavior. It starts with us, and when we become stronger individually, we are stronger together. And so never forget that when we say things like culture and psychology, know that I'm talking about people. People is why we're here. People and our relationships are what make us strong and unique. So let's continue into the journey of our collective selves. I got my lecture notes over here, got my water over here, so everything's right. I'm so excited to teach you this first lesson. We'll see what happens. I'd like to start off with something that I borrowed from one of my favorite podcasts called The Read. And on The Read, every episode opens up with an acknowledgement of Black excellence. So I'm going to do the same, beginning with history. We're talking about human nature and what is our culture, where did it come from, and who gets to determine what it is. So with all that being said, let's talk about a moment in the history of human culture and how now the Getty Images recently announced the inaugural grant recipients that they will be working with to preserve HBCU visual history. And HBCU is a historically Black college or university. Getty Images are the go-to marketplace for visual content around the globe. Anyone can type in Getty Images and you'll see a library of probably thousands, if not millions, of beautiful images. And recently, Getty Images announced the recipients of their grant in partnership with a group called Stand Together, a community that utilizes their diverse network to tackle some of America's biggest issues. This photo archive grant that has been recently announced is an example of anti-racism, inclusion, and dismantling discrimination. How so? By archiving unseen historical content, like this image here, and creating revenue streams for institutions working to create a more equitable and inclusive society. So I probably don't need to teach you that many people throughout human culture and human history have been excluded. And so I wanted to share this moment of excellence and progress, if I could be so hopeful to say, in human culture, is that we are preserving history, and there's a few of us in this country who are doing something to, dismantle discrimination by archiving unseen historical content. So whatever you think of this image, I don't know what year or anything it was taken in, but I did include the source if you'd like to dig more. So what a moment in human culture and human excellence for a group of people to get together and unveil these moments of history to help us appreciate where we've come from and get a good marker of how much farther do we need to go until we get there. Okay. And speaking of us, where are we going? How will we know when we get there? What is a society of inclusion? What is a society of diversity and equity? What does there look like? I want to start off by saying that we do not exist in isolation. The first thing that you need to know about us as humans in our culture is that we are designed to relate. My mentor says, we are designed as relational beings, meaning that when we are in isolation, we do not function at our best and to our best capacities as humans. So I don't know what a society of complete inclusion looks like, but I know what it doesn't look like. And so this is not what we're here to study. This is the opposite of cultural psychology. Cultural psychology is relationship, it's people. We do not exist in isolation. We do exist together, and of course we're stronger together. And here is an overview of where we're headed around the world, of course, a few times. There are differences in body language, religious practices, and wedding rituals. While these are more obvious examples of cultural differences, many distinctions are harder to see because they are psychological in nature. Considering and researching the role of culture enhances the study of psychology and provides insights into our similarities and the differences between people. We want to know, am I the only one? Am I alone? Are there some similarities between my experience, my struggle, my triumphs, and the person that I can meet at the supermarket? And of course, we want to know, am I unique? Am I special? Am I different? So it's a constant balance of our similarities and our differences, because both have the power to bring us together. One of our similarities is, how about how we all start off? We all start off as very similar looking, sperm cells. And then we somehow develop from these cells that look the same and don't look different from anything around them. But we go from that to building pyramids and skyscrapers. We create education systems, and we somehow go from that to everyone deciding to paint our faces for Day of the Dead. I think it's so cool how similar we all start off at these little images that you can't even see with the naked eye. And we can over time rather, create these civilizations. So here's an overview of where we're headed. And let's start with the first item on the list, cultural psychology. Let's, of course, define it before we go any further. The purpose of this image of Piccadilly Circus is to introduce you to the field of psychology, the study of the brain, and how it impacts behavior, and the subfield of cultural psychology. So we have psychology, cultural psychology, which is an interdisciplinary study of how culture reflects and shapes the mind and behavior of its members. So I like this image because we see the old school architecture on the left side, even the older lampposts, lanterns, and on the right side we have what technology has brought us and how technology has even changed architecture, let alone the way people engage with the news around the world. Is that all I want to say about this image? Yes, that's it. The main position of cultural psychology, which you may or may not by now in this point have read in the first few pages of your cultural and psychology textbook. The main position of cultural psychology is that mind and culture are inseparable, meaning that people are shaped by their culture and their culture is also shaped by them. So it's this relationship. One is not better than the other. People are not better than the culture they're in. The cultural rules are not better than the individual people. They are both in the relationship and they both need each other. The purpose of psychology as a broad science, as a broad field, is the science of behavior and mind, or thinking, including conscious and unconscious phenomena, unconscious being dream world, conscious being while we're awake, as well as emotions. Psychologists study how cognitive processes, cognitive meaning thinking, how cognitive processes or thinking affects individual and group behavior. So how does our thinking lead to what we do? How does what we do affect how we think about it? Cognitive psychologist studies how thinking affects individual behavior, while social psychologist studies how thinking affects group behavior. So cognitive means thinking. A cognitive psychologist would study an individual's behavior. Social means relationship, groups. A social psychologist, therefore, would study how thinking affects group behavior. Psychologists also explore how our biology affects individual thinking and behavior. And by biology, I mean like the actual biology of our brain, the physiology, the biology, all of the processes that happen from a brain cell and a neurotransmitter making an electrical chemical reaction, and then I have a thought. And then a few more reactions go off, and then I have a movement, and I act on that thought. So psychologists are interested in the brain as well. Neurotransmitters, brain, nervous system, all that good stuff. There are 4 main goals of psychology. And again, this is the umbrella of psychology, where cultural psychology is one part. The first goal is to describe behavior. By asking the question, what is happening? This first goal of describing behavior or describing what is happening is to improve our understanding and get a sense of whether the thinking or whether the behavior is typical or not typical. The second goal is explaining behavior, which often includes an experiment to explain the causes of behaviors in what situations and when. The third goal is predicting behavior, meaning determining whether the event will happen again. By predicting behavior, we can determine what comes next so we can reduce dysfunctional behavior or reinforce positive behavior. The final goal is to control behavior so that psychologists can change or influence behaviors. I would like to turn now to a concrete example from one of my favorite social psychologists. So he studied group behavior. His name was Elliot Aronson, and on page 240 of a textbook that you don't have, this is from my library, just some light reading about my life as a social psychologist. I'll give you a brief summary of his research and what he did and how he followed these steps of psychology. I'll start with the end. Question number 4, how can it be changed? The question that Elliot Aronson asked was, how can we stop people from dying? Let's put our collective brain power together on that. So the end result is the behavior we want to control, like how can we stop people from dying? As you can see in this picture, this woman seems to be asking the same question because she has a stethoscope around her, and that lets me know that she's doing something in the medical field to help people with their health, help them live longer and stop dying so young. So let's go back to we started with the end in mind. Now let's go to question number 1. What is happening? Well, college students in the 1980s, when Elliot Aronson was at UC Santa Barbara, I believe, college students in the 1980s are having unprotected sex, even though they have awareness that AIDS is running rampant. So the behavior that we're describing, or the question, what is happening, is how to persuade sexually active people to use condoms. This is a very real, meaningful problem in psychology that came from the field of health. So question number 2, why is it happening? Well, Elliot Aronson and his team of researchers, both students and faculty members at his university, they ran an experiment, a few experiments actually, until they got to a satisfactory answer, which was that people are unaware of their hypocrisy. So people are hypocrites and they don't even know it. Question number 3, will it happen again? How can we predict behavior? Aronson writes, and that is how, in 1989, I came to invent the hypocrisy paradigm. In a series of experiments with my graduate students Jeff Stone and Carrie Fried, we invited sexually active students to deliver a speech about the dangers of AIDS and the importance of using condoms. We videotaped each speech and informed the speakers that their video would be shown to high school students as part of a sex education class. In that crucial condition, after they made the videotape, we got them to talk about the situations where they had not used condoms themselves, therefore making them mindful of their own hypocrisy. And it worked. Boom. I like that. So question number 3, will it happen again? Next paragraph. Naturally, we could not follow them into their bedrooms, but we did get a secondary behavioral measure, the actual purchase of condoms. Students in the hypocrisy condition of the experiment bought more condoms than students in the control condition, who made the same videotaped speech, but were not mindful of the fact that their own behavior contradicted their stated beliefs. And we had reason to believe that they were not only buying condoms, but also using them. Several months later, we conducted a follow-up survey disguised as an assessment of sexual behavior on campus by hiring undergraduates to telephone all the students who had participated in the study. We found that those who had been in the hypocrisy condition were continuing to use condoms at 3 times the rate of those in the control condition. So will it happen again? Yes, students will not only use condoms again, but they will use it 3 times more than the students who were not made aware of their own hypocrisy. So how can it be changed? Run the experiment and share the experiment with people outside of that one college campus. Have other people do something to where they're being made to be aware of their own hypocrisy. Then they will convince themselves to change. Okay, that's one of my favorite authors, but I have limited myself. I'm only reading you a tidbit of his experiment. So we move on. If you can zoom in enough somewhere in here, maybe you can find something that says cultural psychology. The purpose of this image is to show you that psychology has been described as a hub science, like the master hub, which means that medicine tends to draw upon psychological research. Medicine's in here, and medicine is mostly used in psychology through the fields of neurology and psychiatry. Subdisciplines also contribute to health and wellness, such as the psychology of why do I feel better after I work out? Another subdiscipline is law and criminal justice field. Psychology might say, will this offender create a dangerous crime again? That and so much more. I can't even see all of the fields that are in there. I'd have to zoom in a whole lot, because this is how many of us actually realize that, hey, if we're talking about people, then we're somehow talking about psychology. So my question is, where isn't there psychology? By studying only Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures, or weirdos, that's the acronym for weird, psychologists, if we only study weirdos, psychologists fail to account for a huge amount of diversity of the global population. Applying findings from weird populations to other populations can lead to miscalculations of psychological theories and may hinder psychologists' ability to isolate fundamental cultural characteristics. And of course, it'll hinder their ability to control behavior. Did you know that approximately 95% of all psychological studies use psychology undergraduate students? This even further reduces representativeness or representation. I mean, how many of us are not psychology students in college? Does that mean that what happens to us doesn't get included in psychological research? Tisk tisk, psychologists who research. We need to do research on people in weirdo populations and outside of weirdo populations so that we can get a whole view of what is actually going on in this thing that humans call life. The 4 goals of psychology that were discussed earlier can be applied to cultural psychology with 2 different approaches. Cultural psychology, this first approach, emphasizes how culture shapes its members. It's an interdisciplinary study of how, meaning it draws upon many fields, to study how cultures reflect and shape the mind and the behavior of its members. Whereas cross-cultural psychology, this one down below, uses culture to test whether some things are the same across all cultures or universal. An example would be cognitive development in children. Cognitive meaning thinking, so memory, attention, not necessarily feelings and emotional intelligence. So take cognitive development in children. Cultural psychology asks how cultural processes shapes how children think. So how do cultural norms, social development, peer group play, how does that shape how children think? Cross-cultural psychology, on the other hand, asks whether the stages of cognitive development developed by Piaget are the same everywhere. If you're not familiar with Piaget or cognitive development, I'll use personality as an example. Cross-cultural psychology asks whether personality traits like being outgoing, anxious, agreeable, rigid, shy are the same everywhere. Cultural psychology, that top one, explores whether cultural practices and processes like social norms, social hierarchy, cooperation, how those shape personality. So it's like, which one is on the other end of being shaped? Is the culture being shaped everywhere, or is the person being shaped by the culture? And we'll get more familiar with these terms as we go along. But first, a leg stretch. Okay, much better. Cross-cultural psychology, as in, is this happening across all the cultures, or is it only specific to this culture, or this part of the world and the cultures here? Cross-cultural psychology has been criticized for cultural stereotyping and for methodological issues that can lead to biased interpretations. Methodological means, what is the method of the research that was used to find this information? So even though cross-cultural psychology has made contributions to the field of psychology in general, it has been criticized, and when people criticize it for using biased research methods, that means that the way they designed the research methods led to the results being more significant led to the results showing more significant differences between cultures. So it's like, well, if you ask a question in a biased way, then of course the answers you find will be biased. So we have to be really clear about the types of questions we're asking, like, why is that culture so weird? That's a biased question, which is going to lead me to a biased answer. But instead, I need to ask a less biased, more neutral question, like, what are the benefits of this culture using fishing in boats versus fishing in offshore? So that's a terrible question to ask. Doesn't sound very interesting, but I hope you can see the differences. And I'm taking the judgment out of, ew, why are they doing that? That's so weird. Let's find out. Very biased versus, I make an observation about this group of people. Let me investigate why they might be doing it. We'll talk more about biased methods in chapter 3. Oh, next, let's define culture. There is a distinction between arts and culture, like that, the kind of artsy culture when you think of, the Mona Lisa, all the great painters and the sculptors, arts, they're so cultured. There's a difference between art culture and the culture as knowledge and patterns that are learned and shared and grow over time between different groups of people. So by now, I know that you have taken your vocabulary quiz, and that lets me know that this is not the first time that you've heard the definition of culture. So let's keep going so that you can gain mastery of what culture is. Culture refers to patterns of learned and shared behavior that are cumulative and transmitted across generations. So let's break that down. Patterns, that means, they happen over time. Cumulative, that means they happen over time. Transmitted across generations means they happen over time. So there's 3 different ways to say it's happening over time. You can't have one culture on one day for one thing. Think of meme culture. Meme culture sprouted up over years of people posting graphics and images to the internet with captions. So, things that happen over time. Well, what are some examples? Can you be more specific? Why, yes, I can. If culture refers to patterns of learned behavior and shared behavior, patterns would be predictable behaviors and thinking based on shared information. Shared behavior, meaning that humans are actually cooperating with each other and sharing what's going on in their networks. Social media has been a huge boost in how culture gets shared around the world. Learned behavior begins at birth by caregivers through direct and indirect examples. Cumulative, think of if you've ever had a final exam that was cumulative. That means the final exam covers all the material in the chapter versus a final exam on the last unit. That would not be cumulative. That would be selective. So culture is not selective. It contains all the information that has been stored and passed across to improve with each generation. And it's transmitted or exchanged from one generation to the next. So that's a pretty cool thing that us humans do. Because culture is learned, that means a couple of different things. There's several implications. Culture is learned, meaning that differences can lead to conflict. Differences can be politicized. They can get real political. Differences can be appreciated. That's ideal. But we know that humans can certainly pass on good lessons. And unfortunately, as I am learning in Game of Thrones that I'm reading right now, culture can lead to conflict. We can pass down feuds with other families. We can pass down stereotypes. We can pass down hate, unfortunately. Because culture is learned, we can pass down our hate, but we can also lead to a deeper appreciation of other cultures. Remember the concept of cultural relativism? that you learned in Chapter 1, and the ability to see perspectives of others, even though you may not agree, but you can still seek to understand a point of view. Understanding that your preferences are, in many cases, the products of cultural learning instead of absolute truth might empower you to revise them if doing so will lead to a better life for you or for others. So, a question to pose to you, the cultural thinker: what are some ways that cultural norms about modesty have shaped current discussions on breastfeeding in public? Pardon me. This would be a very appropriate question. This is a cultural psychology question. Might lead to a research project. Okay. The contents of culture. This section reviews the contents of culture, both material and non-material, more invisible aspects of culture. And we'll also introduce two terms, etic and emic culture, that are linked to the different perspectives within the cultural psychology. Etic is most closely associated with universal, or the same for everyone. Some examples of etics in psychology are emotions, facial expressions, rituals, language, and cognition. Etic is most closely associated with perspectives of cross-cultural psychology. Are facial expressions, are emotions the same across different cultures? What are the rituals across different cultures? Does everyone celebrate weddings the same? Absolutely not. Emic, very similar sounding word. I'll give you my tip on how to distinguish. Emic is a culturally specific examination of psychological processes and how these things might be different from culture to culture because of differences in ecology, the environment, norms, what's normal, like breastfeeding, what's normal, and resources. To help you distinguish between these two terms, I like to tell students that the T in etic, T is for total, to help think of universal constructs. So like T for total, totally, we all do it. All humans have emotions. That is totally true. T for etic. Here's some examples of material culture. Physical objects, of course, material, physical. Byproducts of cultural activity that we can touch and see. We can touch and see architecture, clothes, food, arts and technology, and artifacts. So if these are some aspects of culture that we can touch and see, that implies that there are some aspects of culture that we cannot touch and see. Enter psychology. Non-material culture. Psychological parts of culture, including norms, beliefs, values, and behaviors. These are things we cannot see, but we can experience. Expectations and attitudes are also types of non-material culture. So, for example, what type of behavior is expected of you during family dinner? Because I can guarantee you it's a little different than mine. Some of you may want to know about religion as non-material culture. Religion is generally categorized as beliefs that are formalized and have a clear structure. Spirituality would also be considered beliefs, but they lack the formal structure of a religion. So they're all in this category. Next, we are cruising through. This section introduces Hofstede's value dimensions across cultures. You will encounter these dimensions through the rest of the course in readings and lectures. Hofstede conducted the largest survey at that time to examine work-related values that mapped very well onto cultural values. As a result of replications, 5 cultural dimensions have been confirmed and 2 additional dimensions have been added since the original study was conducted in 1970. So Hofstede was working for IBM, and he was overseeing human resources and relations. He was in HR. If you watch The Office, he was Toby. Hofstede conducted a work-related value studies on behalf of the corporation that included 72 countries, because again, IBM, they were everywhere, 117,000 employees. The study used 20 different languages and 7 occupational titles, like manager or staff or executive. The survey score ranged from 1 to 120. Once the data were analyzed, 5 dimensions emerged. We'll see that in the next 2 slides. There were limitations, namely in how the data would be interpreted. Individuals might not feel the same way as others in their culture. Shocker. The individual data contributes to a pool of data, and when the data were analyzed, all the scores were averaged, so that individual responses may not be the same as the average for the entire country. Are you starting to hear some problems with the methodology or the research methods? Also, people may have been tempted to respond in certain ways on a workplace questionnaire. Maybe they didn't feel they could be honest because they might have been punished by their bosses. Or maybe if they answered it at home, they would have had something different to say. Response bias and socially desirable responding are concepts covered in Chapter 3. So here's the study, and of course here are the limitations that have been acknowledged. Let's check out what the 5 values were. Masculinity and femininity dimensions, uncertainty avoidance, power distance, individualism versus collectivism, and long-term and short-term. In 2010, so from 1970 to 2010, 40 years later, a 6th dimension was discovered and identified as indulgence versus restraint. So let's take these one by one, because that's a lot of information. Masculinity and femininity are the degree to which a culture will encourage or maintain differences between genders. There are some really good examples of each of these in the chapter of Culture and Psychology textbook. And I really like how we have this visual representation. So here are the countries that are more feminine in their dimensions, and here are the ones that are more masculine. Let us all look at the United States of masculine America. Next slide. The extent to which a culture will try to cope with anxiety by reducing uncertainty. How much avoidance is there? Let's play a game. Where do you think America is on the avoiding anxiety and avoiding uncertainty? Yeah. We're a pretty anxious country, aren't we? Look who's not anxious, by the way. So fascinating. The strength of the social hierarchy, or the acceptance that power within a culture is unequally distributed. So this, as you can see, has lots of crossover with masculinity and femininity. Do you think in the United States of America, power is equally distributed amongst cultures and genders? That's a big no. So frustrating. The degree to which individuals are integrated into groups. Are we more individual or are we more collectivist? Where in the world do you think might be collective-minded? Knowing what I know about yoga, I'm willing to bet that the Eastern medicine, the Eastern hemisphere would be more collective, and us here in America I'm going to get me my American dollars. I'm willing to bet that we're more individualistic. Let's see. Oh, look at that. The darkest purple of all, United States of America. And here you go, Australia, giving us a chase for our money in your individualism. And the 5th element, this describes a society's timeline. the degree to which a culture practices delayed gratification. So, do I make a quick buck now in the short term, or do I invest in the long term? Again, I hate to bag on America, but I do think we're more short-term minded. Let's see. Yeah, looks like monumentalism. Oh, look, we're not. Oh, prove me wrong. We're not short-term. We're green. That means we're more, flex, humble. All right, go us. That's what I get for making assumptions about the culture I live in. See, even I can do it. And then finally, here's the map of indulgence. How much do we indulge versus how much do we restrain? Ooh, yeah, not shocked to see that the United States of America is a country of indulgence, especially given our number in, aren't we like number 1 in the world for obesity? If we're not number 1, we're certainly up there. So that would be one example of indulgence versus restraint. Wow, look who's restraining the most. How do two opposites coexist in the same world? That's what we're here to find out. The purpose of this section is to introduce you to the concept of ethnocentric bias and cultural relativism, which, again, I know you know what that means because you passed the vocab test. Content that is covered over the semester may disgust, surprise, and shock you. That's right. Here's your warning. Your warning is that you may be disgusted. But whether you agree or disagree with a cultural norm or behavior is not the point. Pardon me. The point is that I want you to understand that behaviors and attitudes might differ from the point of view of the culture. Cultural psychology is cool because it provides a way to examine similarities and differences. But that as psychologists and counselors, we avoid judgments and bias in our decision making. And that is the expectation I have for you as my student in our course. How can we examine and observe without attaching judgment and bias? Ooh-wee. Isn't that the question of the year? Okay, so I gave you my warning for the rest of the class. I do plan on shocking you and disgusting you, but I will always do it with nurturing and care, curiosity and kindness. So here we go into ethnocentric bias. Ethnocentrism, meaning centrism, meaning like central to. So central to someone's ethnicity, not their gender, not their physical ability. So ethnic-centered bias, ethnocentrism, is a bias that makes us perceive the world from our own cultural lenses and to make negative judgments about the other culture that we're viewing through our biased lens, aka our eyeballs. In ethnocentric bias, the negative judgments, they don't stop there. They're negative because they view other cultures as inferior, lesser than, not as good as. Extreme versions of ethnocentric bias can result in war or genocide. This image shows the Nazi flag and members of the Nazi army. Classic case of ethnocentric bias when taken to its extreme. In the United States, that ethnocentric bias was responsible for the displacement and dispossession of lands from Native American peoples or First Nations peoples, and forced migration and relocation. So that's our own, not to put all of the blame on Germany. We've got some ethnocentric bias in the roots of our country, of course. We are not exempt from bias. What can we do about it? Okay, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's identify the problem first. Ethnocentric bias is also largely responsible for the colonization, subjugation, and forced conversion of African and South African native populations. This is not an experience and a phenomena that happens to other people. I'd like to remind you that the US has our own history of ethnocentric bias that culminated in atrocities against other inhabitants and people. So it's not that the problem is out there. The problem is very present in here, and it starts with here. But actually, really, it starts with here and the heart. And how can we practice acceptance rather than exclusion and bias and viewing others as inferior? You might say that it's a combination of both mind work and heart work. Cultural relativism is the principle of regarding the beliefs, values, and practices of a culture not from your own lens, but from the viewpoint of the culture itself. Originating in the work of Franz Boas in the early 20th century, cultural relativism has greatly influenced social sciences such as anthropology. The concept to convey is that there is a delicate balance between acceptance of others' ways of thinking and behaving, and also speaking out against practices that might be harmful. Ugh, what a delicate balance. A delicate balance between, hey man, you do you, if you love it, if you like it, I love it. And then also, when do you cross the line? When do I need to speak out against this harmful practice? Take, for example, the common practice of same-sex friends in India walking in public while holding hands. This is a common behavior and a sign of connectedness between two people. In England, by contrast, holding hands is largely limited to romantically involved couples and often suggests a sexual relationship. These are simply two different ways of understanding the meaning of the same action, the same behavior, which is holding hands. Someone who does not take a relativistic view might be tempted to see their own understanding of this behavior and view their own behavior as superior, and whoever they're looking at is inferior, perhaps thinking that, oh, because that's different and foreign to me, it's immoral, it's not right. The concept of cross-cultural psychology is the idea that people from different cultures can have relationships that acknowledge, respect, and even begin to understand each other's diverse lives. What a world that would be. People with different backgrounds can help each other see possibilities that they never thought were there because of limitations or cultural traditions posed from their own background. Becoming aware of these new possibilities will ultimately change the people who are exposed to new ideas. So like I said earlier, my goal is to shock you and maybe disgust you, but really what I'm doing is I'm exposing you. I'm exposing you to new ideas. This cross-cultural relationship provides hope that new opportunities will be discovered. But at the same time, it is threatening. And we find this on page 20 of our Culture and Psychology textbook. The threat is that once the relationship occurs, one can no longer claim that any one single culture is the absolute truth. What will we do if there's no true way to hold hands? There's no right way to hold hands. And finally, the end. I'm kidding. There's a little bit more. Let's review really quickly. Let's seal it in. I know I did a lot of talking. Let's seal in the deal with a quick review, and then I'm actually done. Cultural psychology is a specialty within the field of psychology. Historically, the role of culture has been overlooked, and a lot of psychology has focused on Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic cultures, the weird cultures. Culture itself refers to patterns of learned and shared behavior that are cumulative and transmitted across generations. Things that happen over time. They take time to develop, like a crock pot, not a microwave. Can you tell I'm hungry? Etic and emic are cultural perspectives through which we can view psychological phenomena that include non-material cultures like values, attitudes, and beliefs. Stereotyping and ethnocentric bias, the lens that we view each other through, can occur when we view other cultures from our own perspectives, which often results in a misunderstanding or disparagement of unfamiliar cultures. Don't be uncultured. Shout out to the people who took these wonderful photos and put them on Al Gore's internet for me to use to teach to you. Up next, you have Module 2 on cultural evolution. Bye now.